Hello, everyone. My name is Chase Bullock, and this is my TED Talk on the Great Schism. The Great Schism occurred in the year 1054 as a result of centuries worth of ever-growing political, cultural, and theological differences between the Eastern and the Western Church. The primary cause of the split was political in nature. The Bishop of Rome, better known as the Pope, claimed universal authority over the entire church. By contrast, the East viewed the Pope as just another bishop, albeit with honorary significance, while still being considered the first among equals. First, we will discuss what the role of Peter was according to the scriptures and whether or not the scriptures support the idea of the papacy. Roman Catholic Christians often appeal to passages such as Matthew 16 and John 21 as clear papal proof texts. Matthew 16:18 to 20 reads, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. End quote. As we can see in this passage, Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom to Peter and tells him, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. John 21:16 to 18 reads, "He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. End quote. As we can see, Jesus tells Peter to tend to and feed his sheep. These texts, while both appearing as conclusive endorsement of Peter's supreme authority over the church, must be understood in context of other passages, such as Matthew 18 and Galatians 2. And we'll get them on the screen here. Okay. So it must be understood in the context of other passages such as this. And Eastern Orthodox Christians appeal to these very passages as counter evidence to the doctrine of papal supremacy. Matthew 18, for instance, has Jesus giving the rest of the apostles the power of binding and loosing. Matthew 18:18 reads, quote, Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And it sounds very similar to Matthew 16, as we can see. Many fathers interpreted the binding and loosing as signifying the function of the keys. Now, Paul's letter to the Galatians is where things get interesting because in Galatians chapter 2, Paul rebukes Peter for Judaizing. And the context is that Peter was gladly eating in the company of Gentiles. However, when the Jewish Christians from James, the brother of Jesus, came, he got up so that he would not be seen eating with Gentiles. Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14 reads, But when Cephas, who is Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, quote, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? End quote. It has been argued by the East that this passage in particular calls papal primacy into question, because if it were the case that papal primacy is true, how could Paul correct and rebuke someone who is supposed to be his superior? This suggests that authority was more evenly distributed in the early church amongst the apostles and less top-down and autocratic as less papal claims would suggest, as later papal claims would suggest. All right, now we'll discuss what the fathers said on Peter, what the church fathers said. So before the schism, the fathers of the church had a great deal of respect for Peter, certainly, and they held him in a very high regard. They held him up to this honorary status, and they referred to him with many titles, right? And some of these were, Prince of the Apostles, Gate of Sinners, Tongue of the Disciples, Firstborn of the Key Bearers, and lastly, chief and leader of the apostles, right? But whether these titles were intended to imply any jurisdictional supremacy over the other apostles is hotly debated. Roman Catholics certainly believe that this is the case, while the Eastern Orthodox say it was honorific and not literal. However, this did not stop Pope Leo the Great, who held office from 440 to 461, from being the first pope to claim that this supremacy over the other apostles not only applied to Peter, but all of his successors in the Roman bishopric for the foreseeable future. On the other hand, as scholars Pierre Batuful and John Meyendorff note, the Greeks never interpreted Peter being, quote, the leader of the whole world and the foundation of the church, end quote, as ever implying papal supremacy. Batuful notes that it is regrettable that the East and the West never sought to settle this disagreement through an ecumenical council during the centuries when there was still union between the East and the West. Thus, it's not far-fetched to say that this lack of any attempt at reconciling these different interpretations of the Pope's role in the Church only added to the growing division between the East and the West. In order to understand the view of Peter of the early church fathers, it's essential to avoid cherry picking and to read what they said in context in order to qualify any apparent statements of papal supremacy. And we need to qualify this with other things they've said, right? As an example, let's take a look at Saint John Chrysostom, who indeed said Peter was, quote, the mouth of all the apostles, the head of that tribe, the ruler of the whole world, the foundation of the church, and the ardent lover of Christ. However, it's important to keep in mind that he also described the beloved disciple, who is identified as John the Apostle as being, quote, the pillar of all the churches in the world, possessing the keys of heaven, end quote. And he also described the Apostle Paul as being, quote, the world's teacher. Perhaps one of the clearest rejections of papal primacy in the Church Fathers is in St. Ambrose of Milan, who said, quote, nor was Paul inferior to Peter, though the latter was the foundation of the church, end quote. All right. So now we're going to discuss the differences between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, like before the schism actually uh, officially began. Okay, so division started to brew for centuries preceding the schisms, or the schism, obviously. And the Latin West and the Greek East began to differ on a number of key issues. The first of these issues was liturgical in nature, and it concerned the type of bread that was used in the Eucharist. So the West used unleavened bread, which kept in continuity with the Jewish Passover, which also used unleavened bread. The East, on the other hand, used leavened bread as this symbolized the risen Christ, with the rising of the dough and all that. Um, the East saw this as a Judaizing practice, what the West was doing. And so, secondly, we will now look at the issue of clerical celibacy. So, the West held that priests could not be married before ordination, nor could they marry after ordination. On the other hand, the East held that priests could be married before ordination, however, they could not marry after ordination. But Eastern bishops, just like Western bishops, were always chosen from amongst the celibate clergy. So that's one thing they had in common about bishops being celibate. However, this Western practice of clerical celibacy was officially dogmatized in the Gregorian reforms under Pope Gregory in the mid 11th century. But as we mentioned before, it was already being practiced in the West centuries before the reforms. Um, so, thirdly, we will now discuss theological differences. So, most notably, and probably the most important, was the filioque, right? And the filioque means and the Son. And this doctrine refers to the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, while the East maintained that the Son, or I'm sorry, that the Spirit proceeded from the Father alone, citing passages from the Gospel of John to support this idea. This may seem like a minor semantic issue on the face of it, but its implications were actually pretty significant because the West added the Filioque to the Nicene Creed, starting at Spain at the local council of Toledo in 589. And the reason why this was done at first was to combat the heresy known as Arianism. But this decision at the time was regionally made, so it was not an official papal decree. However, the doctrine began to be gradually accepted in parts of Western Europe from the ninth to the 10th centuries. And finally, in 1014, it was made a universal Western doctrine by the decree of Pope Benedict VIII. This became an issue due to the fact that the Pope retroactively added to the Nicene Creed, which the East saw as an abuse of authority, which undermined the consensus-based structure of how the Church made decisions regarding doctrine, which relied on ecumenical councils and not the decree from any single bishop. Lastly, there were differences in language, and the West wrote in Latin and the East wrote in Greek. And, as we can reasonably assume, this only served to exacerbate divisions between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And it only served to worsen the cultural divide and make communication all the more difficult between the two. All right, now we will finally discuss what made the schism official. So tensions were already high between the East and the West by the time 1054 happened, and this is in large part due to what happened the year prior to the mutual excommunications in 1054. So in 1053, Pope Leo IX sent a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius. In this letter, Pope Leo IX writes in a very confrontational tone, as we'll see later. And he asserted papal dominance over the Eastern Church in this letter. And also from this letter, it's very evident that Leo sees himself as the leader of the entire church, and that it was simply inconceivable that anyone could question the Pope, let alone Michael. So Leo wrote in his letter, quote, "You are said to have condemned publicly, in a strange presumption and incredible boldness, the Apostolic and Latin Church, neither heard nor refuted, for the reason chiefly that it dared to celebrate the commemoration of the Passion of the Lord from the unleavened bread. Behold your incautious reprehension. Behold your evil boasting. When you put your mouth into heaven, when your tongue passing on to the earth by human arguments and conjectures, attempts to uproot and overturn the ancient faith." End quote. So Pope Leo the Ninth accused Michael of retroactively going against the fathers of the councils as well by questioning Rome. And in this next part we're going to read, he seems to be anathematizing Michael, but this would not happen officially until 1054. So Leo writes, quote, "By passing a preceding judgment on the Great Sea, concerning which it is not permitted any man to pass judgment, you have received anathema from all the fathers of the venerable councils." End quote. And later on in the letter, Leo makes it very clear, as if it wasn't already, that he believes that no one can question Rome. He writes, quote, "As the hinge, while remaining immovable, opens and closes the door, so Peter and his successors have free judgment over all the church, since no one should remove their status, because the highest see is judged by no one." Unfortunately, Leo died not too long after this letter it was written. However, Pope Leo's legates traveled to Constantinople and placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia, which officially excommunicated Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and anyone who supported him. In response, Michael excommunicated the legates, and so these mutual excommunications marked the official beginning of the Great Schism, which still continues to this very day. And it should definitely be stressed that the Great Schism was already in the making centuries before 1054 ever happened. This only made it official, right? So it wasn't this like sudden breakaway between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. It was gradual, and everything that was happening before has been building up to this moment, right? So that should definitely be stressed. Okay, so although there have been modern efforts between the two churches to heal the schism, notably the Roman Catholic Church with Vatican II. And they've taken an ecumenical approach of the Orthodox, referring to them as a sister church and recognizing the validity of their sacraments and apostolic succession. We should keep in mind that also that reconciliation is definitely more likely than it has been in a very long time. However, it's still uncertain whether or not this will actually take place, since this will require the East and the West to compromise on key doctrines which separate their churches. Um, so we'll just have to wait and see pretty much. But this basically concludes my presentation, and my whole argument here was to argue that the schism was primarily political in nature, while theological and cultural issues took a secondary role um, in the schism. And these political differences arose largely in part due to like differing interpretations of the role of Peter in the early church and whether or not um, the Roman bishopric was supposed to have supremacy over the entire church, or whether or not the Roman bishop was just supposed to be the first among equals, but still held in a honorary status, right? But other than that, thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something out of this. So, yeah.